You learned how to use JavaScript to call a simple web method without a return value in the previous lesson. That's lesson 8.7. In order to call a web method that returns a value, you need to use a slightly different technique. In this lesson, you'll use JavaScript code to call the getMessages web method and display its return value. To begin, open the MegaChat project from your sample files folder. And open default.aspx in Source View. Now let's examine the getMessages JavaScript function. Find the code function getMessages. This function does not yet contain any code. You're going to add code to this function to call the getMessages web method. Now examine the connectUser function. At the bottom of this function, you can see the following code. Message timer equals set interval getMessages 1000. This JavaScript code creates a JavaScript timer that will call the getMessages function every second. That's 1000 milliseconds. You're now going to add code to the getMessages function to call the getMessages web method. Add the following code to the getMessages function. Page methods dot getMessages function response. After using C#, you may initially find this syntax confusing. The code is very similar to the code you created in lesson 8.7. The difference is that you have created a nested function within the arguments of the call to the getMessages web method. The function you added isn't actually an argument. It is, in fact, a JavaScript function that will run when the getMessages web method finishes and returns a value. Without this function, your JavaScript code would have no way of knowing when the getMessages function was finished. When a web method has both arguments and a return value, you need to specify the arguments before the function. You can see this being done in the connectUser JavaScript function. The function you've created within the call to the getMessages web method will run when the getMessages web method returns a value. The response object will retrieve the value returned by the method. Next, you'll add some code to display the returned data using the displayMessage JavaScript function. Add the following code inside the nested function. DisplayMessage response. The displayMessage function displays the value returned from the getMessages web method inside the chatbox div tag. Now let's test your code. View default.aspx in your web browser and enter a username. Now open a second web browser window copy the address from the first browser window and paste it into the second, then enter a different username Position the windows side by side and chat between them. The messages are displayed by your JavaScript code without refreshing the page. Close both web browser windows now and close Visual Studio. You've now completed Lesson 8.8. Call a web method that returns a value using JavaScript.